So once again, welcome. I'm Eirene Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a US-based 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to provide free resources and support to teachers and learners of ancient Greek texts. In today's session, we are going to briefly review the challenges of translating Homer and then consider how these challenges bear on attempts to understand who women are in Homeric narratives and what they mean in the Homeric world. So I'm just going to share my screen right now. And I'm going to keep it out of play mode just for a moment, as it tends to create some issues if people join late, which we do sometimes have. So I wanted to start with Richard Hamilton Armstrong's observation about translation, that it is inherently a mediator, the translator is inherently a mediator between sets of values. This is, of course, true of any translation project across time and space. These images of poets from antiquity and in the last century, I think, strikingly illustrate that the further removed we are culturally and linguistically from the texts we're translating, the more elements we need to accommodate and account for in translation. Poets of antiquity, as we can see in these images, are depicted with lyre and staff, and what in the image on the top left may be a hand loom as well. That will come up later. While modern poets are pictured in their library, among their books, and at their desks. So from the outset, just from these images, we can perceive that the figure that we call the poet in the ancient images is depicted more as a singer, while the modern poets really are being associated with texts. Their apparatus of the two figures across time are very different, and this reflects the cultural divergence that we're going to discuss in today's session.
Eirene, we can
Yes.
only see everything, including the side bar.
How's that?
That's better. Thank you.
Yeah, I will. I was just leaving it out of the play mode because we do still have some people joining. So, all right. So the question we're considering also is, I have to, these are little technical challenges. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So yeah, what are we translating when we translate Homer? Homer, this name, begins to appear in the historical record in the late Archaic and early Classical periods, but this Homer who is referenced is not connected to any texts of the epics that we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey in the earliest sources that talk about him. Rather, he is associated with songs. And during this period when Homer first appears in ancient sources, his songs were recited by rhapsodes at sacred festivals in honor of the gods and heroes of the city, possibly in relay, possibly in a competitive format. And what I want to draw attention to is how this contrasts with the Homeric epics themselves in the way that they describe a performance of epic. In the Odyssey, songs are performed by bards accompanied by a lyre. So from the very first time that we see them, we already have two different ways of imagining them being performed. So even for us, even who are experiencing them in such a different format, even back then, there was a divergence. We also know about the epics that Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the late 20th century developed the theory that our texts of the Iliad and Odyssey, the ones that have come down to us, are the remains of oral performances in which the epics were composed in performance anew each time. So they were composed and recomposed. And this might suggest at least the capacity for improvisation that we associate with the spoken word. However, we also find considerable repetition of phrases in sometimes rather substantial passages within the epics and across them. So when these phrases and passages are repeated, however, they are placed in new contexts each time. So repetition and variation are occurring simultaneously. We also notice a similar phenomena with themes. The theme of the homecoming hero, for example, has a variety of potential outcomes, which we see narrated in the Odyssey via the returns of Agamemnon, who returns and is killed by his wife, Menelaus, who returns having recovered his wife, and Odysseus, who returns to find that his wife has kept his place. The texts that we have are also composed in dactylic hexameter, but whatever this meant to pre-literate bards or even literate rhapsodes who may have been working from some kind of script, probably doesn't mean the same thing as what it means to a modern poet composing in a literate culture who has a variety of poetic texts across time to consult. We might more helpfully think in terms of a musical beat than a modern poetic meter. And then given the performance of Homeric epic at sacred festivals and what we know of gods and hero worship in the ancient world, we can fairly safely assume that the epics tell the stories of gods and heroes in myth, which frame the ritual worship of heroes and gods of cult in historical time. So myth, the stories, and ritual, the practices, are informing each other. So how much of this can we derive from reading Homeric epics in English translation? Obviously, the song and performance components can't be translated into a text, but we can consider how elements of oral composition, namely formulas and themes, repetition and variation, impact our understanding of the source texts when they are incorporated into English translations. So when we read English translations that are self-consciously aware that they're carrying over these elements, does this impact how we experience them, or to what extent does it impact how we experience them? So this relief from the 1st century BC depicts the cause of the Trojan War. It's Aphrodite bringing Helen and Paris together. Overseeing the events is Persuasion at the top left. Aphrodite is pictured holding Helen, who is looking down, and Eros, or desire, is leaning against Paris, whose line of sight is towards Helen. So our Iliad doesn't narrate the events in this relief, meaning it doesn't narrate the origin story of the Trojan War, but we do have a scene that replicates that theme in Book 3 of the Iliad. Aphrodite herself went to call Helen. She reached the high-raised tower. Around her, Trojan women were swarming. Seizing Helen's nectar-scented enveloping clothing with her hand, she shook it. Sorry, I'm just admitting one more person. She addressed her looking like an old woman born long ago, a wool dresser, dwelling in Lacedaemon. She worked beautiful wool, and Helen regarded her most affectionately. Come here, Alexander is calling you to return home. He is there in the inner room on the rounded bed, gleaming in his beauty and garments. No one would say the man had come from battling, but to a round dance he goes, or from a round dance he has returned to rest. So she spoke and roused the consciousness in Helen's chest. And when she perceived with her eyes the goddess's very beautiful neck, breast that provoked desire, and her sparkling eyes, she was amazed, then spoke a word from out of her and named her, Daimony, why do you long to deceive me with these things? As in the relief, Helen in this scene is holding Helen, here literally by her garment, and attempts to persuade her to go to Paris. So though we do not have the original occasion of Aphrodite holding Helen and bringing her in Paris together, the Iliad does provide us with this scene that enables us to understand their union as the work of immortal forces that shape the cosmic order. I'm so sorry, I do have to exit out every time. So as you can see, I've bolded the word daimon. In the Greek text, this is in the vocative, which is the direct address of someone, here, Aphrodite. And I haven't translated it here so that we can unpack its meaning together and then see how it has been translated and reflect on these translation choices. So in his article, Daimon in Homer, F.A. Wilford notes 3 uses of the word in the Homeric epics. The formula daimoni isos is used when a hero confronts a god. Our 2 best examples from the Iliad are when Diomedes attempts to kill Aeneas and is warned to pull back by Apollo, and when Patroclus attempts to storm the walls of Troy and is warned likewise by Apollo. In the former case, Diomedes obeys and survives his encounter, and in the latter, Patroclus does not back off and the god stuns him, leading to his death. The second use of daimony is when a hero attributes an external event to a daemon. And Wilford notes several examples from both the Iliad and the Odyssey. We can also recognize in Iliad 3 that Aphrodite is the daimon who leads Helen to Paris. Finally, we see the daimon referenced as the source of an idea, thought, or feeling within a hero. So Penelope claiming that she must weave a shroud for Laertes in the Odyssey is perhaps the most famous of these examples. So we'll take a look at that scene. And the larger context in which this is occurring is that Penelope is explaining to Odysseus, who is still in disguise, her ruse to hold off the suitors. So a portion of this is, while the suitors urge for a wedding feast, I myself spin traps. My first, which a daimon breathed into my consciousness, was a large cloth. Setting it up on a great loom to weave in the large room, a subtle and well-fitted thing, I spoke among the suitors straightway. Young men, my suitors, divine Odysseus has been killed. Eager though you are for my wedding, be steadfast. Wait for the cloth to come to fulfillment, so my weaving is not destroyed in vain. It is a burial shroud for Laertes the hero, for when destructive fate takes him down, laying him out in death. Let me not be resented by the women of Achaia for allowing a man of great status to lie without a cloth. So I claimed, and their proud hearts and minds were persuaded. There by day on a great loom I wove, but by night, placing myself beside the fire torch, I unraveled. So I escaped unnoticed for 3 years, and I won over the Achaeans. In the first sentence, we can see it's both metaphoric and literal. She's talking about how she prevents the suitors from pressing forward with their demand that she marry one of them, but this trap is literally a woven garment. So the literal and metaphoric collapse into each other. Her speech, so my weaving is not destroyed in vain, has a bit of a double meaning, of course, since she's literally destroying the garment she is weaving in order to bring her ruse to fulfillment. And a daimon, presumably Athena, breathes the idea into her, and persuasion, I won over the Achaeans, is overseeing events. So in both of these scenes that we just looked at, the daimon is referring to a goddess. So a question we might ask is, why is the word daimon used? Why not use the word theos, a god? And Gregory Naj's work can offer us some insight into this. In his The Best of the Achaeans, Naj notes that the word daimon is derived from the same root as found in theomai, meaning a portion, divide, or a lot. So we could translate daimon as she or he who apportions, and the vocative of the noun daimon as you who apportion, or apportioner. Returning to our Iliad book 3 scene between Aphrodite and Helen, we see what happens after Helen attempts to resist Aphrodite's command. Provoked to anger, godlike Aphrodite addressed her, do not provoke me, perverse woman. Don't make me angry and let you go, or I will hate you as terribly as I now love you, and I will devise baneful enmity among the two sides, Trojan and Danaan, and you will perish from evil doom. So she spoke, and Helen, born of Zeus, was afraid. Covering her face with her bright, radiant robe, she walked in silence and escaped the notice of all the Trojan women. Of them, one led her. And we have this concept of escaping notice with both Helen here and Penelope, though in a very different way, of course, in the Odyssey. So Aphrodite's threat of evil doom provokes Helen's compliance. And as with the cause of the Trojan War depicted in the frieze we looked at earlier, Aphrodite leads Helen to Paris. From this, it's fair to describe Helen, I would say, as a captive woman. Her captor is Aphrodite, but her captivity is carried out via the hands of Paris and the Trojans, who also allow him to keep her and not return her. So reviewing what we know about this word daimon, because we still have this question in our mind, why is the word daimon used? Why not the word theos? What we've taken away so far is it's used when heroes confront immortals and attempt to transcend mortal limits. It's used when a god engineers human events, and it's used when an individual attributes an idea, thought, or feeling to an immortal's intervention. We also have from Naj that the noun shares a root with the verb that means to apportion, to divide or allocate a portion. And we can add to these how Naj differentiates daimon from theos, or god. Naj says that the daimon is used to refer to an unspecified god or hero intervening in human life. The word daimon is to be contrasted with theos, God, which is used to refer to a specified God. So from these definitions and uses, I would suggest that the daimon is invoked specifically when wills are in contest. And in ancient Greek, the word for contest, agon, is also a word for a gathering or coming together. So again, things that we tend to think of as maybe separate categories are conflated in the ancient Greek. So to what extent have or can English translations of the word daimon convey all of these meanings. We can look at a few translations as a way to think about it. So here's an inventory of a few selected modern translations. And something we can notice is that among them, only Mitchell renders the repetition in the original Greek. So the word daimon is used in both lines 399 and 420. One in the first in the vocative, Helen addressing Aphrodite, and then later to describe Aphrodite in the narrative. If one has not read the Greek text, obviously from reading these, one would not know that the Greek text uses the same word. And a few reasons this might happen, where we don't see the repetition, is if the goal is to create an English poem in a meter translation, then the translator will be inevitably constrained by that goal, and the meaning will inevitably have to be sacrificed. If the goal is to create a cohesive narrative, whether in prose or verse, then the translator may choose to translate not the word necessarily, but the context of the scene itself as the translator interprets it. So perhaps both factor into the choices across these 11 modern translations. Translations of our Odyssey scene in book 19, in which Penelope explains her ruse to the disguised Odysseus. We see a few new options. We do see God, which is used also in here. It's in the Odyssey version. It's in the masculine form, but we see it used in the feminine form when we know that it's being referred to, that it's referring to Aphrodite. But we also see spirit. That's maybe a way to capture the lack of specificity. A god, Penelope doesn't specify which god, a god, so making it a little indeterminate who exactly it was. But what's also really important here is that in none of these translations can we tell that daimon could potentially refer to either a hero or a god. And so far, our examples have looked only at daimon as it is used referring to a god. So we want to look at a few instances where it refers to a hero. And one of these is in book 6, in the scene between Hector and Andromache. And we'll keep in mind this idea that the daimon is invoked when wills are in contest. So in this scene, this is Andromache confronting Hector on the walls of Troy. She is appealing to him to remain safely inside the walls and defend Troy from within, since if he dies, she will lose her last protector. And she says, Daimoni, your might will despoil you. You do not even pity your infant child, and I too am without a share of it. Soon the widow of you I will be, for soon the Achaeans will kill you, all roused against you. It would be more profitable for me, missing you, to be lowered into the earth, for as yet no other comfort will there be when you pursue your destiny, but grief. There is no father or mistress mother of me. And Hector then responds effectively that his portion of life, essa in the Greek, is predetermined and no man can flee his mira, which is usually translated as fate, but can also mean portion. So he says, wife, all this concerns me too, but with exceeding dread, I would shame myself to the Trojan men and the Trojan women of the trailing robes. If aloof, I shrank from battle as a bad man would. Nor does my consciousness command me thus, since I learned to be a good man, always and first to fight among the Trojans, winning great fame for my father and myself. And then later he says to her, Daimoni, do not grieve excessively for me in your consciousness, for no man will hurl me into Hades beyond my allotted portion. Among men, I say no one can flee his fate. Once he has been born, neither the good ones nor the bad ones. So in this scene, each is trying to persuade the other, Andromache for Hector to keep himself safe, and Hector for Andromache to accept whatever their portion of life is. And they don't have a shared goal here. Andromache wants Hector to live, and Hector wants to live up to what he believes a good man should be and do, which is he should be the first to be on the front line of the fighters and achieve great fame, megakleos in Greek. So their wills are clearly in tension, but also they don't have a similar goal that they're working towards. And again, we can ask to what extent are English translations able to capture this dynamic? And again, if we return to our inventory of translations, we see almost no repetition. Only Rouse and Verity use the same word in the vocative form of daimoni. And here I mean repetition from one to the other. We see repetition within what the translators are doing. But Rouse uses a term of endearment both times, so he keeps it consistent. And Verity captures a sense of the immortal force at work via man possessed and woman possessed. What I found really interesting is that the translations of daimoni, when Andromache applies it to Hector, convey a sense of his power. Cook's strange power, Sax's you're like something more than human, Lombardo's possessed is what you are, Ryu's you are possessed, and Verity's man possessed. But only Verity retains it when Hector applies it to Andromache. And I will just leave that to you to determine, to draw your own conclusions about why this is so. Why is this repetition of concept not consistent from Hector to Andromache and Andromache to Hector? Similar to this scene between Andromache and Hector, the term demone is used by both Penelope and Odysseus to refer to each other in Odyssey Book 23, just before Penelope executes her final test of Odysseus. So here's their conversation, or a portion of their conversation. Stepping from the bath in his form identical to the immortals, Odysseus seated himself again on a chair and made his stand, facing his wife, and towards her he spoke these words: Themone, in you among all women has been given a hard heart by those who dwell on Olympus. No other woman in this way, suffering in her consciousness, could keep away from her husband, who, having suffered so many harmful things, returned after 20 years to his native land. But come, foster mother, meaning Euryclea, spread a bed for him in order that I may lie down, for truly the heart of her perception is made of iron. In turn, circumspect Penelope responded, Themone, I am neither exalting myself nor disregarding you, nor am I very astonished, but I know very well what kind of man you were when you went from Ithaca in the long-oared ships. But come, Euryclea, spread a well-stuffed bed outside the well-built inner room, the one he himself crafted. Setting out the well-stuffed bed there, throw down bedding, fleece and cloaks and shining blankets. So she spoke, testing her mate. But Odysseus, sorely vexed, addressed his careful-minded wife, O woman, truly this word you spoke is exceedingly heart-grieving to my consciousness. So unlike Hector and Andromache in Iliad Book 6, Penelope and Odysseus have a shared goal, which is their reunion. And it's sort of reflected in the way that their speeches are mirroring each other. But at the moment they call each other Themone, Odysseus has not proved himself to Penelope's satisfaction. So they are contesting, but it's toward a shared goal, which is they're coming together. It makes us think of the word Avalon, I think. And Penelope succeeds in provoking Odysseus to reveal himself. And after he says, oh, woman, truly this word you spoke is exceedingly heart-grieving, he goes into an extended narrative about the bed and how he built it. And since only they two know that the bed cannot be moved, of course, Penelope is successful. Her test has its intended effect, and he reveals that he is indeed who he says he is. So here again, we can look at our translations, and what's, again, interesting is that there is much more consistency within and across them, though curiously, none of them really alludes to the notion of Themone as an immortal force. There's strange, a lot of stranges, a deer, and Verity is perverse. So what do we make of this? What do translations of Hector and Andromache seem like? Why do they feature so much variety? And translations of Odysseus and Penelope scenes not. And before we consider that, we're going to look at one more appearance of Themone in this scene, this extended scene between Odysseus and Penelope in Odyssey 22. So after Odysseus has revealed himself and their reunion is fulfilled, he suggests that more troubles await him. And Penelope presses him to tell her about it now. She says, tell me about this trial, since I suppose hereafter I will hear it told. It would not be inferior to learn it straight away. Then Odysseus of many devices spoke in reply, Themone, why do you again urge me exceedingly and encouraging me to tell it? But I will speak and I will conceal nothing. Here again, he calls her Themone, wondering why she would want to hear bad news at this moment where they're finally having some happiness. And as in the earlier uses of the word, translators are consistent with their previous use, right? So we still have the same stranges and extraordinaries and perverse. The element of wills and contests is fairly obvious. Odysseus doesn't want to get into his future troubles now, but Penelope does want him to. And the question we can ask of this scene again is, why is Themone invoked in this moment? What's the immortal force that's at play when Penelope insists that Odysseus tell her about his future suffering now, when they have finally been reunited after 20 long years? And in her book, Elizabeth Wayland Barber asks, her book is Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years, Women, Cloth, and Society. She asks a question that is very interesting for us and may provide a provisional answer. She asks, how do you carry people's fame on down into future generations forever if you don't know how to read and write, or if you don't have a language system, a written language system for preserving them? Here again, we're reminded that our Homeric texts began their existence as songs that were passed by human breath, not through type and a manuscript tradition that comes later. The two scenes in the Iliad that give us some insight into the origins of these songs are both in Iliad Book 6. Before Hector and Andromache's scene that we've already looked at, Hector and Helen share a conversation in which she says to him, Zeus has set a bad fate upon us so that in time to come, we became famous songs for future generations. And then later, in that conversation that we looked at, Hector notes that Andromache's grief in her captivity will be his fame. Seeing you pouring tears, some man would say, this is the wife of Hector, who was first in battle among the horse-breaking Trojans whenever they fought around Troy. And Maria Pantellia in Helen and the Last Song for Hector suggests that Helen is speaking about a different kind of glory, one that does not depend upon the survival of a man or a city. So this is different from the kind of fame that Hector seems maybe a different kind of fame, or maybe how we interpret Hector. We might think he's talking about honors in the here and now. But Pantellia is saying, maybe Helen is referring to a glory that does not depend upon the survival of a man or a city, but upon the continuity of mankind, this idea of breath. Hector's name may survive as long as there are men to sing, and we might add, and women to grieve, per Andromache. In Iliad 24, the condition of Helen's prediction is realized. The cycle of life, death, and glory comes to fulfillment for Hector with real songs, laments performed by Andromache, Hecate, and Helen. Hector is buried surrounded by singers, and Helen fulfills her own prediction by performing the last, or perhaps the first song in his honor. And it's possible that when Penelope asks Odysseus, tell me about this trial, since I suppose hereafter I will hear it told, the connection between pain and fame, it seems to persist, but she refers to telling, not singing. So perhaps we're even getting in the Odyssey the suggestion of an evolving tradition and a shift from bards to rhapsodes. But in both cases, the immortal force is perhaps the epics themselves, as suggested by the apotheosis of Homer relief, pictured here, dating from a fragment is pictured here, dating from the Hellenistic period when Homer had achieved this status of divine figure. And the women, the survivors, are the initial conveyors of epic fame, as suggested in Helen's singing the last, and as Pantellia says, the first song for Hector in our Iliad. One last connection that we can find among these three women, all of whom are involved in this daimon dynamic. One, Helen, who is the cause of the war because she was led by a daimon, and two, who are referred to daimons themselves, is that all three are weavers. We've already looked at Penelope. We know Penelope's weaving very well. In these two critical passages, which appear at equidistant points in the Iliad, the first one 3 books in, and the second one 3 books from the end. In the first one, Iris comes looking for Helen, and she finds Helen in the large room weaving on a great loom, a dark, gleaming, double-folded mantle. She was sprinkling into it the many contests of the Trojans, tamers of horses, and the Achaeans clad in bronze, who on account of her were suffering at the hands of Ares. And in the second one, we have Andromache fruitlessly weaving a garment for Hector, unaware that he has already been killed. And it reads, so Hecuba spoke, weeping. Hecuba has just lamented Hector. Andromache had not yet heard, the wife of Hector, for no truthful messenger had come to bear the message that her husband had stood fast outside the gates. But in an inner room of the high house, she was at her loom, weaving a dark, gleaming, double-folded mantle. She was sprinkling into it patterns of dappled flowers. These are two cosmically significant moments in the epic. At the moment we see Helen weaving, the war has actually come to a halt, as Menelaus and Paris have taken upon themselves to resolve the dispute with a duel, and thus saving the other heroes from having to fight. When Andromache is found weaving in the inner room, time is moving relentlessly forward toward the fulfillment of fate, which is the sack of Troy and the end of the age of heroes. Wayland Barber notes that fate to the Greeks was spun as a thread. Both thread and time were linear, both easily and arbitrarily broken. One could argue that since women were the people who spun, the spinners of one's destiny would have to be women. These divine female spinners are called mirai, or apportioners. We can add to this that Aphrodite also is characterized as a spinner, since she brings men and women together physically, which can lead to a new child, a new thread being born. And Wayland Barber suggests that the Venus de Milo perhaps depicted Aphrodite spinning, and she draws this conclusion based on comparisons with other ancient artistic renderings of women spinning and the position of the Venus de Milo's arms. So very significant connection to weaving. And then, of course, our master weaver is Athena. And this connects the women. Women weaving, of course, connects them to Athena, who is portrayed as the weaver of garments for the goddesses of Olympus. And of course, the famed patron of heroes across the Iliad. And in Iliad 9, we get a reference to Athena weaving. As she's dressing for battle, she poured down upon her father's floor her fine peplos, many colored, and this word can also be translated as intricately embroidered, that she crafted and toiled over with her own hands. Donning the chiton of Zeus, the cloud gatherer, she armed herself with a breastplate, the apparatus of war, bringer of tears. And in Iliad 14, as Hera is dressing for her seduction of Zeus, she put on her ambrosial robe, which Athena, having crafted it smoothly, set into it many cunning designs. And again, Wayland Barber notes that Athena represents everything that human skill and know-how, techni, where our word for technology comes from, can accomplish. She is a goddess of civilization itself. So perhaps we can say that Homeric epics connect women, the first singers and the first weavers, to this project of civilization itself through both craft and song, and civilization not as monuments and buildings, or even of written texts, but of carrying on the traditions and allowing them to evolve while still honoring the core and the essence through time and across time. Just want to point out also that cloth had an important role in ritual worship of gods and heroes in classical Athens. Perhaps the most famous example is the weaving of a peplos that was delivered to the cult statue of Athena on the Acropolis. And this garment took 9 months to prepare. It was overseen by the priestess of Athena and woven by prominent Athenian women. Evie Johan Halland, in her article Athena's Peplos, Weaving as a Core Female Activity in Ancient and Modern Greece, notes that the arts of weaving belonged primarily to women and were the principal vehicle for demonstrating their various roles as mother, provider, worker, entrepreneur, and artists. And so the production and ritual dedication of the peplos demonstrate the importance of women's responsibilities. And when we consider the critical passages in which Andromache and Penelope are both sent back to their loom and their distaff, which are rendered in almost the exact same language, this imperative, which we might interpret as being dismissive or belittling, actually seems to connect them to their locus of authority. So we see the scene in Iliad 6 when Hector tells Andromache, going into the house, take care of your own works, the loom and the distaff, and urge your handmaidens to go to their work. For war is the concern of men, all of us who were bred in Ilium, myself most of all. And Telemachus in Odyssey Book 1, when Penelope comes down to complain about Phemius's song, says, going into the house, take care of your own works, the loom and the distaff, and urge your handmaidens to go to their work. For speech is the concern of men alone, and me most of all, for might in the house is mine. So just to make sure that we're not thinking to critique previous translators necessarily, I do find this very comforting expression, one of my favorites, and I thank Lauren, who is here, for drawing my attention to it, a beautiful expression of translation, which is that any theoretical remarks offered by a translator are bound to be an apology for his failures. Obviously, no sane translator can allow himself to dream of success. He only asks for the best possible failure. And it's in this spirit that I want to propose 3 questions for us to consider in the time that remains. One of them is, to what extent do modern translations convey the role of women in Homeric epic in the Greek sense? And to what extent can they? And what this is purely on my end, what is the optimal translation of them on? I would really be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And so I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can discuss. Let's see. Always an adventure to find the record button.